And then over a period of time, with that balance, it's become more of the norm. So to be less impulsive and more thematic about everything, especially as it relates to business.
Welcome to The Profitable Table, fed by Woolco Foods, a podcast at the nexus of hospitality, business, culture, and the mind. Now here's your host, Woolco Foods CEO, Stephen Toberoff.
Hello, everyone, and welcome to another episode of The Profitable Table, fed by Woolco Foods. I am your host, Stephen Toberoff, and today I'm very much excited about my guest because it's someone that I have a lot in common with and someone that I invited to be a guest out of a real, wonderful moment of serendipity. I was out to dinner for my 21st wedding anniversary at a phenomenal restaurant called Spring House in my town, Tenafly. Had a great time. And the next day I'm reading this terrific article in the New York Post about my guest and all of the things that he's doing. I reached out to him and he was kind enough to come in. So without further ado, let me introduce my guest, Jonathan Krieger, who is the CEO of Cure Companies? CEO of Cure Companies. Jonathan, thanks a lot for coming in here, man. I appreciate it.
Thanks for having me.
So I know from preparing for the interview, you've got a lot of different experiences in the investment space, the hospitality space, but to just sort of start us off, would you mind telling us a little bit about yourself and then how it was that you came into all of these different investment avenues and Cure Companies? Just bring us sort of up to date a bit before we get a little more granular into the hospitality side.
Sure. So I was brought up in the Upper East Side, then moved to Great Neck, was a horrible student. I was always attracted to more creative, less structured things. Made it through high school, went to college, and then ended up in, I guess, the field that allowed for some creativity, but a little less structure. I think I was pretty unemployable in a traditional 9-to-5 job. And that was in brokerage, office brokerage and real estate. And that was in 2002. So a pretty horrible time right after the dot-com crash. I ended up managing buildings, leasing office space. I was pretty successful early on. I found myself in a great environment with good people. And one of the buildings I was managing had a retail space that came up for lease. And the guys looked at me and said, "You'll handle that." And that sort of kicked off this journey into an exploration into retail, which I developed a tremendous passion for. I say that, the retail spaces within a community are the lifeblood of that community. So if you have a 7-Eleven, Duane Reade, and, Chase Bank on a street versus a SoulCycle, Equinox, and, boutique shopping store, everything changes. The value of the buildings, energy of the community shifts dramatically. I ended up getting poached by, at the time, the largest retail brokerage firm. Over a 5 or 6 year period, I got to work with a lot of different entrepreneurs. I would say most notably the 2 women who started SoulCycle, and got to work with them from the time they were in the back of a townhouse on 72nd Street until they exited to Related. And I got to watch that journey, a lot of others, a lot of failures. And then I sort of tried my hand at it. And I would say at this point, I've probably conceived of 10 different concepts and signed over 50-something leases in terms of my own signature and, my own spaces between the different brands. But ultimately, I just have a tremendous passion for building, for creating new experiences, for real estate. And I think a lot of that has to do with employment, the ability to offer somebody a job and a good job within a good environment is exciting. And on the other side of it, the ability to offer consumers a good product that has a meaningful experience to it is a sort of, the rewards of that they never stop.
So it's very interesting. And I love the sort of journey from the real estate into retail. To go a little bit sort of more granular, deeper, when I was, again, preparing for the interview, I was reading a bit about your internal journey about leaving New York City and coming to New Jersey, which is something I went through as well. I was born and raised in New York. I moved to Jersey before you. But I would love to get your thoughts in terms of what that process was like. And to even lead into it, I read in the article that you're very bullish and have a lot going on right now in northern New Jersey and Bergen County. So I'd love to know your thought process about leaving New York to the extent that we could characterize it as that, and what it is about New Jersey, Bergen County that you're so bullish on.
Yeah, so I left New York because of COVID. I left in a day. It was March 16th. I remember the day like it was yesterday. I think the aircraft carriers were docking in the West Side Highway. I looked at my wife. I had a kid who was 3, and I said, they're going to lock this place down, and we're not going to get stuck here. And so we left everything in our apartment and moved to my parents' house for 2 months, and then continued. We ultimately ended up here. But so I would say it was a fairly traumatic experience. We were also operating 26 different retail stores between 5 different brands at the time. So we had to let go of almost 400 employees. So trauma is probably a good word to use.
Yeah, and I can totally relate to that. It was the most challenging experience I've ever been through either, John. I mean, our revenue here dropped 82 or 86% in 1 week. So I think trauma is the right word, just to interject, because I totally feel what you're saying there.
Yeah. But ironically, and I hated Great Neck growing up until March 17th. March 17th was probably one of the happiest days of the previous 10 years of my life, which was very strange. So I was running at 1,000 miles an hour for 10 years. We were opening up at full throttle, close to a store every 2 months, between the different brands. And that is an insane level of intensity. I was an absentee father. My relationship with my wife was to shit. And all of that seemed normal because I lived in New York. And I think for a lot of entrepreneurs in New York, sacrificing your lifestyle, family, mental health is sort of okay because everybody else around you is mostly living that way. But this forced stop and then moving and then being out of the city. And I remember I took a walk around my old childhood home, the block, and I felt this sense of calm. And I say this and feeling pretty bad for the people who had the opposite experience. COVID was probably the most enjoyable experience in my life. I thought for me, it was a full reset of everything that I understood from a personal level, on a universal level in terms of how government works, doesn't work. It was a profound experience, but I enjoyed it tremendously. And from Great Neck, we ended up in Baltimore for a year and a half. It was an opportunity to be next to the rest of my family. My sisters were living there at the time. I was planning on moving upstate New York and work. I had a contract for an 800-acre piece of land in a town called Blooming Grove to build I'm calling it like an eco-luxury community. And that fell, and I moved up there. And I was in contract to buy a home on the property, and that was going to be the next 6 years of my life. My kids were in school. And in a 48-hour period, the entire thing fell apart. So I only had a couple of days to get out of the Airbnb I was in and find another house for my family. There was a U-Haul in the driveway. Like, this was real.
Wow.
It was between Westchester, Southampton, and Tenafly. I ended up in Tenafly because the lease in the house that I rented was signed before the other two. That was it.
Amazing. It's funny how these sort of traumatic events or these extraordinarily unpredictable events can be catalysts for tremendous growth, because I would also say, the experience of COVID on the one hand was, as I say, from a business standpoint, the most daunting challenge. And it also, the way that it was handled from a government standpoint and otherwise, evoked a lot of feelings. At the same time, I think where we're at as a company now, in almost every meaningful metric, I could have never imagined us being at this level if you'd have spoken to me in 2019. And even on a personal level, I think it makes you better coming through those challenges. Now, with respect to Tenafly, that's where we have some commonality. I've been living there myself for a while. And in Tenafly, just to sort of continue the discussion, and this was, of course, brought up in the paper as well, the restaurant that you've opened there, and I know you have one in Englewood, and we'll get into it, Spring House, not only was it great cuisine, you were able to, through the decor and just the overall vibe, bring something that was very reminiscent about New York, or something very sophisticated that I haven't seen living in the suburbs before. So my question is, when you moved to Tenafly, were you inspired by that move to start opening businesses, or had you had that idea prior to moving? And then I want to sort of probe a little deeper on how you've sort of created that vibe, because it's obviously very deliberate and it's extraordinarily unique.
So for starters, I definitely didn't have this concept before. If you'd have told me that I'd be living in New Jersey 4 years ago or 5 years ago, it would have been 100th on the list of places. So that was sort of circumstantial. It is in my nature to always study an area. It's sort of, that was my career, understand buildings, streets, communities, cities, and then try and figure out, what should be where. That is at my core what I love doing and what I spent my time doing. And so that's what I did, when I moved to Tenafly for the first couple of months. And I guess pretty quickly, there was this sort of assessment of, there's a very strange thing happening here. This is probably one of the best demographics you could have from a consumer standpoint. And it's probably one of the worst downtowns you could see relative to that. And so then the question was why? That's a whole other sort of path, but super interesting because it got me involved in things that I never thought I'd be involved in, like politics. And so those two things, that's kind of an equation, right? Are the consumers there? And is there demand and are there options for those consumers? And the answer was the consumers are there, and there aren't a lot of options for them that are at least on par with what you would see in places like Manhattan, which is where 60% of these people all moved from. Definitely over COVID, right? So the math worked on that. Then I just kept passing the building, right? So I'm a real estate junkie. It's an unbelievable building. When I first passed it, it wasn't. It was pretty run down. But so those sort of things came together. I ended up meeting the mayor to really understand why this dynamic existed, why the downtown didn't look like Greenwich, Connecticut, because the money is there, the affluence, and there's a reason behind it. And I think it's very similar to a lot of the dynamics in suburbs around this country. And I think it's a microcosm of a much larger issue, which is that entrepreneurs and thoughtful individuals who are business-minded want to stay the hell away from politics because it's pretty broken, as we know, but they have better things to do with their time. And what we see in politics and what we see even like on a town level is sad. You have individuals who have no business being in these positions, making decisions for 15,000 people. Most of them have never had any business experience, and they're managing budgets by way of Tenafly of over $120 million. Zero business experience. But nobody else runs. And so you get a town, again, thousands of towns, that's being run by people who have no idea how to run anything. But it's a power play. It fills the ego. And so they hold on to it for dear life. And I got to learn all of this. And then I got to get involved in it because I'm just a person who can't sit back and watch that kind of stuff happen. And because selfishly, and everything I do is selfish, I'd say this proudly. For me, I want to be the happiest guy in the world as often as possible. And I think that starts with yourself, your family, and your community. So I'm doing this mostly because I just want to live in an unbelievable place. I want my kids to live in an unbelievable place. I want my friends to be within that place because it'll make me happier. I mean, that's it. So Tenafly is just this perfect opportunity because it is an unbelievable town. I think, genuinely, from an outside perspective, not a resident, it's probably one of the greatest towns in the country, in the entire country. It has a level of diversity that is unbelievable. And it has this huge percentage of population that's within their 40s and 50s who are highly entrepreneurial and very sophisticated. And it's very safe, right? It's got a strong middle class and a strong upper class. But that's very rare. And you don't see a lot of issues going on within the town relative to what you might see in certainly towns right next door, Englewood, Teaneck, et cetera, right? So it is a perfect opportunity or canvas to create, what life might have looked like or felt more like in the 50s and 60s. That's my goal.
Well, I couldn't agree with you more. And it's funny you mentioned that analogy because when I describe it to my friends who are from New York, because I grew up in New York City and got married and had my first 2 kids in New York and moved out to the suburbs in 2008. I lived in downtown New York. I lived in Tribeca before we moved. And with no traffic, I could get from my apartment to where I live now in under 25, 30 minutes max, more like 25. But once you cross that bridge and you're into it, it is almost like Mayberry. You know what I mean? It really has that. And yet there is that also underlying sort of, I don't know if the word is sophistication, perhaps the better word is urbanity. And I agree with you that it has not been reflected in the downtown or in a lot of the businesses. But I'm very grateful to God that we moved out there and raised the kids out there because it's been unbelievable for them. So as I was listening to you, it actually brought up another question, which is, because you have invested and built up a lot of different brands, is your thought process to first look at the real estate side of it and then come up with a concept based upon your assessment of that area? Or do you have a concept that you like? And then, because as I'm listening to you and it's really quite fascinating. You came to Tenafly, which was not on your list of places you ever thought you'd live. You assess the community. Based on your assessment, you then find a piece of real estate, and then you then convert it into this exquisite representation of what you envisioned. And it's very successful on every level. So I really want to understand that. Is that something you find the real estate first, or is it the concept? How does it go?
There isn't a process to it. I'm very much a believer in flow and sort of being open responsibly to sort of what the universe brings. So it wasn't like I assessed the market in 3 months and then said, here's the strategy. I'm not that smart. I really do approach everything based on what shows up, and then an evaluation of it, whether it's something that I'm going to want to participate in and enjoy as a customer. Obviously, whether it can generate a profit, which was actually the first iteration of Springhouse, was a great example of that. It was an unbelievable exploration of like an intention without a sound business model. So probably spent $500,000 creating, I'm not sure if you know about this, but we first created this community cafe wellness center, which is all stuff that I love. Ultimately, it was a nonprofit. People could come in and spend $6 for a coffee and spend 4 hours. And so I looked at my wife and everybody else and I was like, yeah, maybe one day. But right now I have no interest in subsidizing this, right? For the next, 10 years. We're in the business to make money and make people happy. And this is not it. So we almost sold it. So we got a couple of offers from people who wanted to develop it, but ultimately it was too important to the community and to the bigger plan. So it's a mix and match. I mean, we have a portfolio now of 4 brands, right? We own a company called High Exposure, Fat Choi, Padel United, and Springhouse. They're all within a 12-minute drive of my house. That's a strategy because there's an operational intelligence to that, but there's also, again, and this is how I live, it's enjoyable. I don't really want to get in the car and drive an hour and a half somewhere. I did that for 10 years in New York, commuting around from the Upper East to the Upper West to downtown to Midtown. It's miserable. So I would say it's a combination of, it's a universal intervention of, here's an interesting concept and let's go find a great piece of real estate, or here's a great piece of real estate and what can we do with it that would create a great concept. That's sort of now. As it relates to the go forward strategy with something like Fat Choi, that was also totally random. I met the chef because I brought him in to consult for the original spring. And he started telling me about Fat Choi. And I became obsessed with him and the concept. And I said, hey, I got a space in Englewood. Let's go do that. Now that's a different thing. That's going to be a concept that we're going to scale. And the exercise is how do we go from 1 to 5, 5 to 10, 10 to 40, et cetera. And that won't, and that's something that I've done my whole career, and I'm super excited about it. But we've also learned and iterated. We opened it up, won like every award you could, started to realize that it wasn't the right concept. It had like the foundation of the right concept, and then shut it down. We just finished the rebuild of it, and we're going to reopen in 30 days. There's one commonality. It's actually not coming into it with the this is the right model, and then this is the model that actually ends up as the model.
Yeah.
It's more of like, here's a great idea. Let's go try it. Nah, we kind of need to fix these 5 things, which could mean anything from gutting a 300-year-old building to, a small renovation within a quick serve concept. So
what's so interesting as I'm listening to you is you obviously have a lot of vision and a very expansive mind. But having been to Springhouse and being in the hospitality space, I can say this is not flattery. This is really pertinent to my question. The food was exceptional. The design was exceptional. The service was exceptional. So in addition to this expansive mind and vision, you're obviously excellent at execution, and you'd mentioned operationally. Can you talk a little bit about how you achieve that excellence in execution? Because I'm familiar with the 4 concepts that you just described in New Jersey. 2 of them are restaurants. One is, I would say, an adventure type thing for families, and others fitness. What's your process when it comes to execution on these things?
Yeah, so I'm so happy you asked that, because I get to say that like so little of it has to do with me. I take credit for almost none of what you just described by way of Springhouse. So you said the food is amazing, the design is amazing, and you talked about the service.
Yeah, so you've put together a team of individuals.
There you go.
Yeah.
Right. So that's where I guess I could take some credit, right? So
yeah.
Real estate for sure. That's always sort of my thing. I have an unbelievable partner who's the chief operating officer of the company, named Brandon Hirsch, who's managed thousands of employees across, God knows how many venues and different kinds of concepts. But I've never trained a staff member. I've never cooked anything in the kitchen. I was like lightly involved in the design. I found the building, understood the dynamics of the community, knew what we needed to do by way of like permitting, processing, liquor licensing, the legal structuring, the investment, the cap table, all that stuff I can do. I actually enjoy it at this point. The rest is the team. And even that, 5 weeks before we launched Springhouse, we didn't have a chef. I mean, I can't tell you how many times, how many interviews and people. I'm like, oh yeah, that's the one. And then just dud after dud, And it's funny with Springhouse in particular, and there is something that's unique about the Springhouse, different than anything else I've ever done. The history of that building, it's a 250-year-old building, it's a historic landmark, but it has this story. So I don't know if you noticed this, but it's on the actual original owners, their pictures, front and center, as soon as you walk in, with a note of the 2 of them. And we only found this out 4 weeks before. The names of these 2 people were John and Julia Lyle. So I'm John, my wife is Julia. We didn't know this. And there was a Hebrew day school for 14 years before we took it over. And when we ran it, people would come in, moms, and would say, have you seen her? And I would say, who? And they said, the ghost. I'm a pretty spiritual guy. It's not like out there for me. I said, no, but this happened like 14 times. Like, oh yeah, our kids you would find them talking to this woman. It's a woman and she's great. I said, terrific. If it's a good ghost, that's great. We've all experienced something in that building by way of like an energy, to the point where when we make decisions, or when we were making design decisions in the building, there was a sense of responsibility to these people who lived in this building. And I still feel it. I feel a genuine, not just to the community, but to the building. And I mean it. And you said, you feel something, it's there. There is a unique thing to that building, and it changed the way I approached the building and the process. I was much more connected.
Well, that does explain it, because when I walked in there and you have the beautiful bar to the right and there's different rooms, there was a uniqueness that I have not experienced in any restaurant in the suburbs. And that's very cool. So with respect to the execution, it is putting together great teams. But I really appreciate the fact that you have such an expansive mind and approach to business and creativity. One of the things that I believe, I would be curious to know your thoughts, is I think, because my background, if you want to call it a background, is I was a literature major in college. And I'm somebody who, in my spare time, I still enjoy reading literature, philosophy, and bringing those concepts to bear in other aspects of my life. And as I'm listening to you, there's a lot of what I'm hearing that is not just traditional X's and O's of finance, of real estate, but it's emanating from almost an expansive mindset. Is that something you're conscious of and try to cultivate? Or is it that you've just achieved a level of confidence and relaxation that you're able to just activate and move through these dynamics in a unique way?
Yeah, only recently. It was a problem my whole life, right? I mentioned from the very beginning, I was a horrible student, had a miserable time, from kindergarten, up until college was just a big party. So, whether ADHD and dyslexia and all this stuff, only after COVID and an unbelievable amount of mistakes over a long career was I able to sort of hone in on what you mentioned, right? A creative energy, a drive, a relentless drive, once I've decided that I want to do something. But I didn't really have much of a process prior. So I have 1,000 ideas a day, and that's a problem if you try and execute even a small percentage of it. Mm-hmm. And so I touched the stove plenty of times, right? Not 3 times, probably 10, and learned that way. I also learned by surrounding myself with people who I care about and who care about me, who I trust to guide and help ensure that I'm on the right path. Most importantly, my wife, who's a major check on me. And then over a period of time, with that balance, it's become more of the norm. So to be less impulsive and more thematic about everything, especially as it relates to business. But, no different than parenting too. I mean, it's just a way of being. So, I'm 43 now, so I guess it's taken me a long time, but I don't know that it's different than anybody else's processes, whatever they may be. But I'm very lucky. I've had a lot of tremendous help and a lot of leeway from the universe and from people, and because I've played very hard on all facets of life, business, personally, socially. I'm a guy who kind of wants to do everything, always. And that has to be managed, because if it's not, you just go right off the rails. And I've gone right off the rails.
It's interesting because you're mentioning, and this is so important, and we have a number of listeners that are listening because they're entrepreneurs. You mentioned the importance of learning from mistakes. You also mentioned the importance of the people you surround yourself with. I definitely think that one of the most important attributes for being an effective leader is the ability to cultivate a group of people around you that are exceptional and that you have a relationship with, where it's mutually beneficial and it's people who are comfortable speaking with you, sharing ideas with you, bringing ideas of their own. But if you were advising someone who's just starting out as an entrepreneur, you have experience in a number of different concepts. What would you say were the top 1 or 2 mistakes that you made that if you could share with somebody before they begin the journey might help them the most? If that, again, a lot of times I think the process is such that the individual only really learns going through it. But then again, perhaps there are some lessons that would translate to somebody just starting out.
Well, so I think if you look at entrepreneurs in general, maybe, I don't know, check me on this, right? But I think entrepreneurs are generally risk takers, right? And so that comes with a certain kind of personality. And maybe it's something similar to what I just described of myself. So, I wish I had learned a lot of the disciplines and practices around mindfulness, I would say, prior to doing anything. Because whether it's your own money or investors' money or, even more than that, or just as important as that, the employment of human beings, right? If you're starting a business, somebody's livelihood is on the line as well. Is to be able to look in the mirror and say, it's similar to before I got married, I went through this process. Can I look myself in the mirror? Do I know what a great leader, founder, CEO should be? Am I that person now? Or is there some stuff that I need to work on that could make me that person? Because there's enough out there by way of every medium, around self-exploration and mindfulness and becoming a better leader, or the books and the podcasts or whatever. But can you look yourself in the mirror? Do you have a vision of or an example of who a great CEO or founder is that you emulate? And do you match up even remotely close to that? Or are you still, partying too much or doing too much of that, right? That's going to create an issue for it. So I guess there's that. And then, nothing should be done impulsively, right? I would say that, usually it's a spark of some semblance of creativity or idea pushes you to that next phase of taking a concept to birth. But have you given that process enough of a gestation period versus, I have a great idea, I'm going to go do it tomorrow? Have you gone to the people who you feel like are going to give you a real answer, which most people don't, because they don't want to hear no? And have you pushed it out into that sphere enough to feel really good about it versus you feeling really good about it, right? Mm-hmm. And actually, most recently, I think I may have even been fault in that, a year ago with Fat Choy, which we opened up vegan. I mean, I can't tell you how many people said, why in the world did you open a vegan? Are you vegan? Is the chef vegan? No. Why are you opening a vegan restaurant?
Yeah.
And now we're not, and we're reopening it and it won't be vegan. There's a million other things that are happening that we've learned from that'll allow for it to be a much stronger business to scale. But you always get caught if you're a great, because you have ideas and you have the drive, you're the guy. So, but I like to keep these people around me. And certainly I know for myself, and I have a coach and who will always call bullshit. Always. And they still have a hard time calling bullshit because I'm a pretty strong-minded guy. My wife ultimately could always just look me in the face and be like, just shut the fuck up.
Well, I think that's a credit to yourself, though, that you have that self-awareness to, one, surround yourself with people, but also, two, to listen to them. And I like what you said about mindfulness. I agree with you. I think that the psychology or the mindset of the leader is going to be the single biggest factor determining the success of the organization. And so cultivating the appropriate mind, I think, is a very important thing to do, and I would encourage people to do it early on. And the only thing I would add to what you said, and you'd alluded to it before, is when people start businesses, they get very enthusiastic. But I think it's important early on to know your numbers and to review them consistently. Because one of the things, again, about your story that I really appreciate is how many times you've tried something, understood it wasn't working, pivoted, made changes, and it gets successful. So understanding your numbers isn't going to mean that you don't make mistakes or don't make changes, but it's going to give you visibility into things that if people are not attentive to, can knock you out of the game completely.
And I would just add to that, right?
Yeah.
Because, and again, this is, for me, I love to air it all out, right? I'm not a big numbers guy. And so one of my things very early on always was to bring in a great numbers guy and to give them the power to be like, hey, if this goes just a couple of points that way, the alarm goes off. If you see, you need to be on top of it and in it, because there are great leaders that are also, finance guys that take on these things. And that's one skill set. They lack vision or, whatever. To do it successfully, you've got to have 5 to 7, strong qualities and characteristics. I don't know anybody who's got more than 2 or 3, max. So you better have some other people around you if you're going to do something successful that can, make up the difference. I think that's one of the biggest issues I see. And because I get pitched every week by people starting companies. And usually it's around, a retail concept. And I just, and somebody's great at whatever, anything. And I look at them and here's the growth plan. And we're going to open up 5 or 6 stores. And I'm like, oh, okay. And where's the team? Well, I do that. I said, well, who's doing the real estate? Is it a broker?
Yeah.
Because just so we're clear, you're going to raise $5 million, $2 million, 70% of it's going to the security deposit, construction, leasehold, right? Like, who's the expert? That I see almost all the time, especially in brick and mortar. And it's insane.
It's an excellent point, and I couldn't agree with you more. I think that when one cultivates mindfulness as a entrepreneur, business leader, what have you, you're going to understand very quickly what's important. And if you do an honest self-assessment, you're going to identify strengths and non-strengths. And what you have to do is exactly what you said. Find people who have the skill set that you have a high degree of confidence in, communicate to them as clearly as possible what you need from them, in addition to whatever insights they may bring, and then listen to them. Yeah, absolutely. You're absolutely right, because so much about the game of business and entrepreneurship is vision, is expansive mindedness, is drive, is execution, but it can't be done by one person effectively.
No. And I'd say even as an overarching kind of character trait, and I guess this is personal to me, but it's to some degree, there needs to be a level of humility. I've run companies, with partners, who fell on all sides of the spectrum. And I would say that unequivocally, you're running a business or you're running a substantial business with a lot of employees, which is personalities. If you have a big ego, you're creating a miserable environment for just about everybody. And it's going to show up. And I think, that might have worked for a period of time. And there's a balance of all this, right? I say I'm the most ruthlessly compassionate person, and ruthless is separate from compassion. They have to coexist. So there has to be an understanding of what the job is and the demands of that job. And like, this isn't a party. It's work. And we'll try and create as good an environment and situation where you can make money and grow, et cetera, but do your job and do it the way you're expected to do it, which is a whole other problem that we're dealing with in society. And it's a massive generational issue. But if it's all ego, man, it is just, God knows what these people are living with internally, but I do know, because I've watched it, what's surrounding them is just this constant beratement of that guy sucks and who wants to work for him and always just, I wish I could go somewhere else, because it shows up everywhere. So I don't know, it's something that I've never, I guess I've seen it too much, but it was always pretty unattractive to me, especially being in real estate. I mean, New York City real estate is like the epitome of this stuff. And I made a very clear decision, I think 8 years into this thing, where I watched all these guys who were worth the most amount of money. And I just one by one said, wow, I never want to end up like that. I never want my ex-wives to talk to me about that, my kids to be like that. Like, if that's what the bar, if that's what the North Star is, I got to get the hell out of this. And then there were other guys who were like, that's exactly what I want. And and that's the world. But where we are today, if you're employing, I mean, whew.
As you were speaking, I was nodding my head because I'm so much in agreement with you. I think one of the worst, maybe the worst characteristics, you talk about humility and lack of humility, but there are people who have this insecurity and hopefully lack of self-awareness where they view the workplace as an environment to act out psychologically in a manner. Everything in business, and really in life, but certainly in business, should be done with a results-oriented mindset. And if you're results-oriented, you understand that the objective for the people on your team is to get the most out of them. And the way you get the most out of them is when they feel an ownership interest in what they do. They feel a creative interest in what they do. The last thing I would ever want to do, I'm very blessed because I have a lot of senior leaders here that have been with me for a long time. And every single one of them is super comfortable saying to me, you know what, Steve, I hear what you're saying. I disagree with you on this. Let me tell you why. If you don't have people doing that, think about how much damage you're doing to your business, because I don't have expert visibility into the accounts receivable or the purchasing or customer service or sales. And people who are egotistical like that and contaminate their business like that, it's one of the most obnoxious self-inflicted wounds. So I couldn't agree with you more. And I think it's the very antithesis of strength and leadership. Because if you're a strong person, you're not going to need to project this false image of strength through a form of dominance, which is complete bullshit anyway, you know?
And listen, to get to it, like, or to sort of like really dial down on it, unless you're a sociopath, an employee coming up to you and telling you how excited they are by the culture and the environment and how it's so different than where they worked before. The reward of that kind of interaction, for me at least, it's so beyond any monetary value. Like, it's just so unbelievable. The power that you're providing a job for somebody who's inspired and who feels good versus walking around knowing that everybody's scared of you. I mean, how does that fit in the psyche? It's a totally broken human.
It's a broken human, and I think a lot of people have misinterpreted stories that they've heard about. As you say, you mentioned the real estate industry, but there's stories about, in the realm of business, Steve Jobs, or in sports, Bobby Knight, or these other people, but we don't really know them, and I don't care who it is. I've never found a way intellectually to understand creating that dynamic of wanting people afraid of or resentful or angry towards you. And certainly, I really felt it during COVID when, if I didn't have the senior leadership team that we have, it would have been a wrap. But the level of commitment and creativity and persistence was incredibly humbling. So I think you're absolutely right. And I think that probably is also a very important thing for people to think about in the beginning, not just in themselves, but with other people. I think in business, you've got to find people. I did a podcast on this a few weeks ago. The defensive mind, meaning people who cannot hear information without feeling this heightened need to defend themselves. And of course, what are they really defending but this illusory notion of themselves? It's not a real thing. But when you have people like that, it creates a lot of friction.
Yeah. Yeah, you could feel it. You could see it from I'm hopeful that that mentality is dying off.
Yeah, I think it is.
Yeah.
So this has been an absolutely wonderful conversation, Jonathan, and I could talk to you really all day, but I just want to end with one question because I'm very curious about it. One of the things that I've observed, and I'm really curious your thoughts, is now, as I said, I have 3 kids, right? My oldest is now in college. My middle guy is still in high school, as is my daughter. But living in New Jersey, been to a million different towns with the AAU basketball games and all the other stuff that people do. And I've always been blown away by how charming and how lively and wonderful many of these towns are. What do you see, if you look out 5 to 10 years, do you see a real change occurring in the towns you're involved with to reflect people maybe from New York City appreciating this quality of life? Or it's been this way for a long time, and you're, of course, making changes in Tenafly. But I'd love to get your thoughts about northern New Jersey or just suburbs in general from a business retail perspective and what you see happening in the future years.
I'll speak to northern New Jersey because it has a lot to do with what's happening in New York, obviously, right? We're 20 minutes from the city. In my humble opinion, New York has been and is continuing on a decline. It's a miserable place to do business, from a retail operating standpoint. And I'm hopeful because my roots are there and I love New York. I'm hopeful that from a government and administrative standpoint, corrections can be made and it can become a pro-business and safe place. But until then, if New Jersey and some of these towns, and I guess Bergen County, which I've had great experiences with, lean in on this, they're going to attract an unbelievable group of entrepreneurs, who are in their late 30s, 40s, who've done some stuff in the city and really just want to get out, whether it's because they have a kid and they're having a second and a third. At some point, you get tapped out. And if what happens in Tenafly can happen in some of the other areas, I'm now in 4 different towns. So I'm in Cresskill, Northvale, Tenafly, and Englewood. I know every single one of the mayors, and I've been before all of the boards. And they're wonderful people. They want to see growth. And if that continues to happen with a little extra, PR marketing, if you will, New Jersey and North Jersey will see an economic boom, and we'll see first-class experiences. And not that there aren't now, but a sort of a wave of new, and the same by way of population. I can speak to Tenafly because I think in the next 4 years you won't recognize Tenafly, and not in a bad way, in a very conscientious, intentional way. That doesn't mean skyscrapers. It just means different types of retail that's of a better quality, with better operations, and name it down the line. That process has already started, and we're going to continue to invest in Tenafly substantially. But North Jersey, Bergen has this tremendous opportunity to take advantage of what's going on in New York City. And I know, because I do speak to these people at the economic development, level, and that they're aware of this and they want to do this. There's nothing bad about growth. It's only bad for a small subsect of people who are typically the loudest. But nobody's coming in and trying to build casinos and strip clubs.
Right.
This is an intentional group of people that want to do things that match the needs of the consumers.
Wow. Well, I really hope that continues to happen. And with you leading the charge, I'm very confident that it will. So, Jonathan, this was phenomenal. If people want to get in touch with you, what's the best way on social media or anywhere? If anybody has a question after listening to the interview or whatever.
Yeah, I'm not on social media.
So maybe.
But I have a Facebook account that I never check because it's just Pure Companies is our website. And
all right, so check them out. If anybody has, because every now and again we'll have guests on and people have questions or they've learned something.
Yeah,
so if
anybody who wants to get in touch with me can get it. I'm
Companies.
I love talking to people, and I especially enjoyed this. And this was my first ever podcast, so I'm very appreciative that it was from my neighbor.
No. It was really cool because as I was reading that article, I was like, wow, I'm going to reach out to this guy, and I'm glad we put this together. And it was a great interview, a lot of value and a lot of enjoyment, and I'm very excited to have you, doing what you're doing in Tenafly because I haven't lived there. It's a great addition and was there for my 21st wedding anniversary, so we'll always remember it. So really awesome, Jonathan. Thank you, man. It was a real pleasure.
Thank you so much.
Thank you for listening to The Profitable Table, fed by Woolco Foods. Please be sure to rate and review the show on Apple Podcasts or your favorite podcast app. And to learn more about Woolco Foods or Stephen Toberoff, please visit us at Woolco.